And then we're going to get into a very important body of work that those of you that have done live classes with us before have worked with, and particularly those of you who have done classes with us this last year have worked with. And this is a very important part of classical initiation that has only come out in fragments, unfortunately, in modern metaphysics. And this is the central column of energy in the human energy body. This is the most fundamental large structure of energy in the human body, which is our vertical axis of energy. In earlier times, it was referred to as the column of glory. And I have a handout for you that gives you some of the tracing of this back into the Persian Manichaean tradition and some of the ways it's manifested with the Taoists and with the Himalayan tradition and with the Coptic tradition of Egypt, things of this kind. This is a very important central axis of energy in the human energy field. And so this column of glory has other names and other traditions. That's the one that it has in the Egyptian Coptic tradition and in the Persian Manichaean tradition. So we're either going to use that term column of glory for the central axis of energy, or we'll call it the central pillar. It was called the middle pillar in the Kabbalistic teachings. And so we're going to introduce tomorrow the concepts behind this structure, and then we'll go into particular aspects of the structure that we can tap into. And then in the evening tomorrow, we'll be doing actual practices with the column. Because once you're aware of the column and able to put your consciousness directly into some of the centers, particularly in the higher levels of the column, above the human head, it becomes much easier to directly perceive both the non-physical beings directly, as well as to perceive what we're going to refer to, taking a term from Dr. Samuel Sagan at the Clear Vision School, to perceive packed thought forms, which again is highly concentrated information that we can receive as a totality, instead of it having to be unpacked into one image or one word after another. And once you get to the point that you can actually perceive the packed thought forms, which is something that comes from developing the higher centers above the head, then this type of angelic communication becomes much easier and much more direct. This is something that's rarely talked about publicly, but it's something quite fundamental, and actually not that difficult to do for human beings today. So we're going to talk about a few of the beginning practices with the central pillar, some of which we've done in previous classes, not all of which we'll do in this class, but to give you a sense of some of the foundation of this type of work. And then connecting to spiritual beings through the central pillar, and then talking about the process of angelic communication and how this relates to the centers below in the central pillar. Because with our central pillar of energy, we have the challenge that as modern consciousness became more and more left brain rational, this was a development that also coincided with more and more patriarchal cultures. And as culture became more patriarchal, more and more of the mysteries connected to the divine feminine and to the yin polarity got more and more taken out of the mysteries. Now, one part of this is that, as the Taoists explained very clearly, that when you're moving to areas above the head in the central column, this is a kind of a yang polarity, with the yang polarity of what in their tradition would be connected to the forces of heaven. If you move below the body in the column, you're moving into the earth, into the yin polarity. And so in classical systems like the Taoists, they're very straightforward about the need to balance the movement up with the movement down. It's fairly simple and obvious if you think about it. If you go too far up without grounding downward, you're going to become very unbalanced. So the whole thing needs to be a balanced structure, and we'll get into the details of that later. But you will find that in many modern, very patriarchal systems, they have excluded the knowledge of the column below and working with the centers below. And this will be anything from saying, well, you simply can't do it because those gates have been closed for a long time, to actually saying in some traditions that it's a taboo. It is absolutely forbidden. You're not allowed to connect to the centers below because these are connected to detrimental spiritual beings and forces and black magic, and it's absolutely not permitted. But again, you will tend to find, particularly as this gets into the more rigid and fear-based attitudes toward it, that this comes the more you get into highly patriarchal systems. and that there's an essential part of initiation to understand the centers below and to connect to them. And so we're going to clarify some of that in this class, because again, although for the vast majority of people, the clearest angelic and non-physical communication will come in the beginning with crystallizing the consciousness at the centers above the head, because that's the closest to our current center of consciousness, which is in the thinking realm, in our heads. The centers below are also extremely important. They have their own highly advanced functions. And again, we need to balance going up with the going down. Then we're going to talk about the centers actually within the human body in the column of glory. And one thing we'll be adding in this class, for those of you that have been with us in previous classes and worked with the central column in those classes, is we're going to be clarifying that in addition to what we think of in a very common model as the 7 chakras in the body, we also have a series of chakras that run from the trunk down. So from the perineum down to the feet, there's also a series of 7 for a total of 13. Now this is not the only possible system. One thing that we've introduced in our online Spiritual Science Essential Teachings and Practices class is at the very beginning we do an overview of some of the most prominent systems today about energy centers in the human body and about the different sheaths of the human body, what we would call subtle bodies, or spiritual bodies in different traditions. And you'll see that different traditions use different schema of these things. They'll have different numbers of centers or different numbers of subtle bodies. So in spiritual science, we don't want to get too rigid about, oh, the 13 chakra system is the only real system. There's many different ways you can approach it that are valid. But we're going to be presenting one particular system here. But again, we want to keep a type of internal mobility because there's a concept here that I have not described in this handout, but I've spoken about in some previous classes that I just want to clarify this principle right now. And it's a principle that I've never seen described externally, but again, just becomes self-evident at a certain point. And it's what I refer to as the number prism. And the number prism is that if you divide the number of subtle bodies a human being has into 3, that will clarify certain phenomena and certain possibilities that the human being has in initiation very clearly. But it'll hide other possibilities that you might get if you were to divide the number of subtle bodies into 4, or into 7, or into 9, like other systems do. So if you're going to do healing, for example, and you train in an Indian Ayurvedic system, there's 3 major differentiations of what you look at with aspects of human health that are connected to the doshas and things like this. Whereas if you were to train in Chinese medicine, you might have 5 basic differentiations, which would be the 5 elements. But if you trained in a Western Greek system, it might be 4 elements in differentiation. Now, how you divide those phenomena into 3 or 4 or 5 is going to determine what gets clarified and what is not clarified as much. So there's a reason why different traditions divide things into these different numbers, because the number acts like a prism. When you put white light through a prism, you then find that inherent within the white light is the possibility for all these other colors. And so the number that we use for division, this is actually connected to sacred geometry at a very profound level. The number you use for division is what you use to actually purify out or clarify out specific aspects of the totality. And once you have clarified it in your own consciousness, you can then use it for practical work in healing or consciousness development or whatever it is that you're focusing on doing. And so again, we're going to be presenting certain systems in this class with certain numbers of centers, etc. But again, we want to make sure it doesn't become dogmatic. And so that's why I just explained the principle of the number prism. There are other ways that it could be approached that would lose some clarity of what we're going to get in this class, but it could clarify other things we won't be discussing. Then, the last 2 parts of our table of contents are related to an advanced practice that you'll see references to in multiple traditions, but in very fragmented forms.